Welcome to our advocacy webinar on the EU Taxonomy in partnership with Aurora Energy Research. Before I hand it over to the moderator, I would like to say a few words about United Europe. United Europe is a non-profit organization nurturing cross-border cooperation of companies, policymakers, individuals, and especially the young Europeans. Please consider becoming a member so you too can support us in driving forward our ambitious agenda of making Europe more united, diverse, and competitive. At these challenging times, we have to be a European team and we have to speak with one voice. I would like to give a special thanks to our longtime member and advocate, Hans Quinnish. Hans is moderating and co-hosting the webinar tonight. And now, with no further ado, I would like to hand it over to him. Hans Quinnish is the head of commission projects at Aurora Energy Research, and he will lead us through the discussion tonight. Hans, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Daria, and thank you very much for joining us on this very momentous day, where it's the first time we're seeing a full-blown invasion of a European country by another country in over 70 years. One could have the idea that that discussing a technical topic like the taxonomy on such a day is absurd. And to be quite honest, this morning I thought very briefly whether we should call it off. But there are some clear connections, and I think it's important to have the discussion which we're having today. So it's good to go ahead, and thank you for joining us. On the one hand, of course, today's happenings will make the financing discussion for new LNG import capacity and alternatives to Russian imports even more acute. On the other hand, of course, we will start having an even more urgent discussion about the alternatives to gas-fired power generation, like nuclear, and we've got nuclear represented on the panel today, but also like long-duration storage or biomass, for instance. So it's great to be going ahead, and thank you for joining us. I'm very happy to welcome four extremely qualified panelists to discuss this topic with me today. They are, and I go through alphabetically by the first names, Ingrid Nestle, who is a member of the German Parliament and the Energy and Climate spokesperson for the German Green Party caucus in the Parliament, and I think I'm not exaggerating if I say like one of the most important and savvy energy policymakers in Germany. We've got Laurie Fitch, who's a partner in the strategic advisory group at PJT Partners, and I'm not a banker myself, but as far as I can tell, one of the best connected bankers in the energy and industrial space in Europe. It's great to have you, Laurie. We've got Michael Müller, who is the CFO of RWE, which is of course one of the largest utilities in Europe and a major potential investor in new gas-fired capacity. And we have Valérie Fondon, who is the Director General of the French Nuclear Energy Society, a strong voice for also European or for nuclear in the wider European context. So welcome, Valérie. And yeah, to kick us off, I'd like to turn to you, Michael, because you represent a company, as I said, that's investing in power generation assets across Europe and could potentially be investing in gas-fired assets. Can you tell us what, especially to those of you who haven't been following this every day for the past couple of weeks and months, can you tell us what the taxonomy is and how it affects you as a large power generator?
Yeah, thanks, Hans. Also, warm welcome from my side. So basically, the idea of the taxonomy is to provide a classification for activities that are sustainable. So it should be supporting investors to take, or the capital market to take right decisions on where to invest into. And therefore, what the taxonomy does is it classifies activities as sustainable and non-sustainable. And the way it does it, it's first there is a list of objectives, and if the activities you do meet those objectives, which are climate change mitigation, climate change adaptation, it's water and marine resource protection, it's circular economy, it is pollution prevention, and it's biodiversity. So if an activity is supporting one of those six activities, it can be classified as sustainable. But in the second step, it must not cause any significant, or that must not cause significant harm to one of the others. So that's the principle. So when talking about our business, obviously power generation, all the investments we do into renewable energies, so into wind and solar, they are classified as sustainable. Our legacy business in lignite is.
I think, Michael, you got muted.
Okay.
Okay.
Now I'm back.
Yeah, you're back. Yeah, great.
So where did I miss you? So
legacy businesses.
Okay, so our legacy business obviously is not classified as sustainable, and there lately has been a discussion about gas assets. So the question is if gas assets, especially new build, can be classified as sustainable. And the latest proposal by the Commission takes the following perspective: if you build a new build asset and it replaces existing assets, and it has a emission over the entire life cycle that is less than a certain value, then it is classified as sustainable. And to put that into context, so if we calculate, for example, in Germany, if we would start to build a CCGT, a gas asset, that would come online in, let's say, 28, then this asset must be converted into hydrogen by 35. And if we do that, there's an opportunity to classify that as sustainable. So that's the whole concept. I mean, maybe a take on this one. I think in principle, it's a very good approach because it helps investor to provide a classification. To be honest, it puts a large burden, administrative burden, so it could have been made much easier. Just give you an example. Typically, you do financial reporting based on legal entities. The taxonomy criteria are based on activity, so you have a totally different perspective, and you have to document not only that an activity is sustainable, but also that it doesn't cause significant harm. So there's lots of efforts to provide that. So that's what I don't like about the legislation. But in principle, I think the idea of classifying activities in a positive way, so which activities are sustainable and which are not, is a good approach.
Okay, thank you very much for the introduction, Michael. Very happy, and very happy to get this scene setting. I'd now like to turn to Ingrid because well, your party, the German Green Party, has been traditionally quite critical of including gas and nuclear in the taxonomy, and now you're in government in Germany, of course, and you have to support a compromise that's been found. But I'd still be interested in your personal view, if you could share it. Do you think nuclear and gas are being treated too well in the taxonomy, or can you see a rationale for including them?
Well, it's no secret that we'd much rather have both out than both in. And I agree, Michael, with you when you said that the taxonomy is a good approach. We think so too, and that's why we want it to be a success. And we think having both nuclear and gas in actually is makes it more difficult to make a success out of a taxonomy, because it's less credible that it really is a sustainable approach. I definitely do think that the nuclear is treated too well. I don't see that this is transitional the way it's being built. I don't see that a technology that delivers waste that needs to be guarded for 10,000 years could be sustainable. Not talking about all the risks. So I really think this is a huge mistake to include the nuclear. I have a little bit different opinion on gas. Having said that, we could very well have lived with both out. I think we have to start to differentiate between fossil gas and gas-fired power plants, which can run with different types of gas. And in the past, it was just the same. So from a climate point of view, gas-fired power plants were simply bad, you know. But this is not true, because even in a 100% renewable world, we will have gas-fired power plants. You know, they are not only acceptable, they are necessary for the 100% renewable future. And that's where I think we have to start to make a distinction. And actually the taxonomy does not say fossil gas is fine, use fossil gas as long as you want, but it says, okay, it's fine to build these power plants if you switch really quickly to other gases, which I think could be defined more strictly, you know. There are always things that you might want to do a little bit different. But in general, I think this idea at least is compatible with a pathway to renewables.
Thanks a lot, Ingrid. And well, I think perhaps unsurprisingly, you've been very critical of nuclear, which gives us the perfect segue to turn to Valérie. Well, you of course speak for the French nuclear industry. Do you have any response to Ingrid? And B, yeah, can you tell us a bit about the status nuclear has in the taxonomy, how it's being treated, and whether you think that treatment is fair or whether the restrictions that are being placed to it are too strong?
Yeah, so of course, nuclear was controversial, as usually it is in the European discussions. I have to say that there's been, because there was a controversy about nuclear, you know that nuclear is low carbon. It's actually, according to IPCC, 12 grams per kilowatt hour. So it's one of the lowest emission source with wind. Actually, in France, it's 6 grams, so it's even lower. Because we actually enrich uranium with low carbon electricity. There was a special report. So the decision was delayed on nuclear because there was a special report that was asked to the Joint Research Commission, commission of experts in Euratom to evaluate the literature and the scientific literature about how nuclear complied with all the criteria. And the answer from the GRC that was that nuclear complies with all the criteria, including on the waste management, because as you probably know, waste management is heavily regulated and controlled in Europe. Actually, we have the deep geological storage solution, which is actually recommended by the European Union as well as a means to store nuclear waste. Nuclear waste is not in contact with any the biosphere, so whether it's nature or life, fauna, right? We are now in the transition category, which doesn't comply with the conclusion from the scientists, because we should be in the sustainable category. And the consequence is that we have to revise the technical conditions every 3 years, which doesn't make sense, because first, nuclear is a long-term energy. When you build a nuclear plant, it's going to operate for 60 years. So it's kind of bizarre to say that it's in a transition category. But also we absolutely need to be able to have a series effect in our industrial programs. We need stability in the technical criteria. So we're hopeful that NSREC, which is the Association of Safety Authorities in Europe, will be able to explain that and provide some stable technical criteria for us. Yes. I would like, maybe as an answer to Ingrid as well, to remind ourselves that nuclear is in all net zero scenarios. It's in all 89 1.5 degree IPCC scenarios from the special report 1.5 degrees from 2018. And some of them see a tenfold increase of nuclear in scenarios. It's in the IEA net zero scenario with a doubling of production by 2050. Even if there are lots of renewables, we need nuclear because it's dispatchable, it's low carbon and dispatchable, and it's scalable. And then it's also in the European Commission 2050 a scenario where it's 15% at that time of the production of electricity in Europe.
Okay, thanks a lot, Valerie. Last but certainly not least, Laurie, you of course talk to investors and the financial markets every day. So what I'd like to know from you is, are we paying too much attention to the taxonomy? Perhaps, like, does it matter in shifting capital flows that much, or is the impact we're attributing to it in this discussion or we have been attributing to it over the past months, has that been overblown?
Thanks, Hans. I mean, I guess the short answer is yes, it matters. Sustainability really matters. And the taxonomy, as it stands, just underpins a much wider definition of what might be considered sustainable. And so if you look at the fund flows, I mean, there's a 500 billion per annum and growing fast green bond market, and that will pay attention to the taxonomy ultimately. And there's a $5 trillion sustainable funds market in Europe. And equity fund managers are forced to pay attention. First, they're forced to pay attention to sustainability, but what the taxonomy does, as I said, widens the aperture, and it will sort of allow those funds to catch more investments that might be in transition or on the cusp, and it will allow them to take those into their funds when they might not have. And then, ultimately, even though some funds will have to exclude companies that don't have the right targets, ultimately, by underpinning this, the taxonomy reduces cost. And if that's by 25 basis points, which is a lot in a really long dated asset on a cost of capital that is already relatively low, it makes a huge difference, and it will make a lot of things cheaper, and it'll make a lot of companies investable or uninvestable, depending on how they fit within the taxonomy.
And these 25 basis points you mentioned, are these a PJT estimate that you came up with, or is that just a number you gave as an example?
No, but let's just say, bond spreads, for example, and Michael knows better than I do, there's just a lot more demand for the amount of bonds, green bonds, for example, or sustainable bonds issued, and that compresses the yield or the cost for the issuer. And of course, whether a company is investable or uninvestable, I mean, it could be much wider than 25 basis points on the WACC. In fact, if one would get a designation or multiple on your stock, for example, that would be a 1 or 2 or 3 turn PE premium, it would have a much bigger difference on the company's cost of capital than that.
Okay. Great, thanks. Thanks a lot. I'd now like to turn to a discussion with all of you. I've brought a couple of questions which I'll put to the panel, and you should all feel free to answer. And we'll do that for around 20 minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. So to all of you who are in here, actually a few familiar faces as well. You already start thinking about what you would like to know from our panelists. You can either message them in the chat function, or you can actually use the raise hand button, and I'll then pull you up for you to ask your question in person, which is a bit more personal and nice. But before that, I'd like to come back to something you said, Michael, about pragmatism, and I'd like to put to all of you the question whether the taxonomy really reflects market realities, because it really makes very detailed prescriptions for what operators have to do kind of 15 years out, without even knowing whether there'll be sufficient quantities of hydrogen to convert a gas plant, or what that hydrogen will cost. Of course, you have to make a business plan and you have to make assumptions, but I mean, that's quite a lot of micromanagement. Like, an alternative could be to say, okay, actually we have an emissions trading system, go build the gas assets, and at some point it will be too expensive to build these gas assets on natural gas, and you'll start running them on hydrogen because that's cheaper. and that solves the problem that we can get rid of the taxonomy or the micromanagement altogether. Would that not have been a more sensible approach?
Well, I mean, as I said, I think you could have done taxonomy more pragmatic, but at the same time, I think introducing a classification is clearly helpful. I mean, like Laurie says, I mean, if you want to do investments into, for example, green bonds, there needs to be some kind of green classification. So I think that's absolutely fair. I just want to raise one topic, which is, I think, especially important for industry. And that is the taxonomy currently looks at basically two different criteria. One is describing the status quo, which is revenues. So how much of your revenues are sustainable and how much are not sustainable. They actually also have OPEX in with a weird definition of OPEX, but basically looking at the status quo. And second, they ask for CAPEX, now investments being sustainable. And I think that's a very important difference. And that actually is for me also the crucial criteria where I have difficulties with. Because, I mean, take us as an example. We have a really heavy lignite, or had a heavy lignite and coal portfolio, but we have a clear commitment to transform that portfolio into a renewables portfolio. Now, this is the transition that needs financing. And that's actually also the idea of the whole taxonomy and also of the green transition, that you fund those companies with cheaper money to enable the transition. Now, if you only look at the status quo, that hinders kind of the legacy business in the industry. And the worst thing that can do and can happen is that basically those parts are sold to private businesses. So indeed, they still operate and taken from the public market. So therefore, what we are strongly pushing for is rather look on CAPEX, because CAPEX is clearly demonstrating how much of your investment you're putting into the new technologies and how much speed you really put into transition. And that's actually the part of the taxonomy which I think we need to be careful with, especially if we take Germany, kind of the whole automotive, chemical industry, steel industry. They have a huge path ahead of them, and that needs funding. And if we just look at the status quo, we don't help them to transform. And that's why I also believe we need to have that positive list. And all the discussions about negative lists really don't help. Because like Laura said, it doesn't only make financing more expensive, it actually leads to a lack of ability to finance your business.
Would anyone like to react to that? Ingrid, you perhaps? Do you see any political scope for a positive list?
Well, it's kind of difficult to reopen the taxonomy debate right now, as a proposal has just been given. I can see your point, and yes, it's the transition that we want to finance, and yeah, I can see that that there is a sense in what you're saying. If the question is whether I believe that we will make a new taxonomy this year, well, only if the old one fails, of course. So this is in hands of Parliament. I don't know if there's any room to react actually to Valerie with the nuclear stuff.
No, sure, of course.
Yeah, I'd love to just give a quick reaction on. Well, I heartily disagree that we know how to deal with the waste. You said there are very strict regulations. Yes, they are very strict because it's so extremely difficult to deal with it. We still don't have a solution. But maybe another point, nuclear will simply be too late and too expensive. In my opinion, it's kind of a hoax. I mean, all 3 new nuclear power plants that are being built in Western Europe are a decade late. You know, it doesn't take a decade to build them. They are 1 decade behind their schedule. And they are so much more expensive than renewables that it's, in my opinion, it's just tearing away money, time, and political energy from the issues that really could solve the issue. And then people sometimes come up in Germany and say, well, but let the old ones run longer. You know, the 3 that are still running, they produce like 5% of the electricity and less than 1% of the energy we consume in Germany. And even if you look worldwide, I think we are around 4% of the energy consumed is nuclear. It's just not a solution.
I don't want this to turn into a.
No, I would like just maybe to go back also to something Michael was saying and Laurie was saying. So, of course, and to quickly answer Ingrid, I'm not against renewables. I think all scenarios say we need everything we can to resolve the climate change, right? So some countries will use nuclear. You're not obliged to use nuclear. Some countries, we're in the middle of a presidential debate. We have several candidates that say they want to relaunch a nuclear program. So the voters will decide, right? Coming back to what Laurie was saying, in our country, I mean, if we assume our current president would be re-elected, with other candidates also want to launch a new nuclear program, it's clear that the cost of capital is crucial for us. Nuclear is very dependent on the cost of capital. Right now, the assumptions we have is that we have to reach 4% as a cost of capital. So it would mean that we need to find a way to reach that. And what's really amazing is that we see a difference of 10 billion per year between a system without new nuclear and a system with new nuclear. So 10 billion per year. It's quite significant. And the effect of not having really affordable capital makes the whole system costing more, right? So if nuclear costs more, the electricity system costs more, that means electricity will cost more, and we desperately need a lot of low carbon electricity to be able to electrify, right? In France, the target is to go from 25% of electricity in our current energy system to more than 50% of low carbon electricity in our future energy system. You see that in all scenarios, they will need a lot of low carbon electricity. This low carbon electricity needs to be very cheap.
To link it back to the taxonomy, and maybe I'd like to hear your views on this, Laurie, because from my perspective, it's very challenging to build nuclear without kind of a very strong state support anyway. So isn't the much bigger lever in getting to the 4% actually some form of regulated asset base or CFD or whatever, however you structure this from the state? And the taxonomy becomes actually a bit irrelevant to markets in that regard, and if at all relevant, because it helps to unlock state funding.
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Yes, Hans, I couldn't agree more. I mean, for the record, I am pro existing nuclear. I'm skeptical of new nuclear simply for the cost. It's the economics that don't work. The math doesn't work. And I'm skeptical of gas. Sorry, Michael, but I'm skeptical of gas. For the CO2. And I'm it's so ironic that the Green Party has switched to this horse. Having said that, who's building new nukes? State actors, exactly. State actors around the world. And as much as it would help them immensely to have a lower cost of capital, they're going to build them anyways. So I'm not sure at the end of the day, the cost of capital, I mean, I appreciate for you, Valerie, it's helpful to your cause, but ultimately they're going to get built for reasons that don't necessarily have anything to do with economics.
I think Ingrid wanted to respond to Laurie.
Yeah, I just would like to make a quick comment. I don't know if you have seen that, but there's been an issue of grid bonds by Bruce Power in Canada to finance their nuclear upgrades and the upgrades for long-term operations of their plants. And it's been really, so they have issued green bonds to fund their long-term operations of the plant, which is included in the European taxonomy, by the way. And it's been oversubscribed 5 times more than what they offered. So I think we will need contribution from this type of funds into the whole system. It's not going to be funded 100% by state, right? We'll need a mix, right? And I think the taxonomy will help us, gather all the money to make it. That's it.
Yeah. First, Ingrid, I think on gas, and then Michael, perhaps you would also like to come back on.
Yeah, thank you so much for the chance to reply, Laurie, to your big deception that we switched horses. And it's very important for me to say we did not switch horses. We've been very clear even before we got into government, when we described the 100% renewable world, the climate neutral world, you know, the non-CO2 emitting world, that yes, in the electricity sector, we would have a substantial amount of gas-fired power plants that would run very rarely, you know, because we will do everything we can with wind, solar, because that's the cheapest, and biomass very limited, hydro is very limited. Yes, so we will do everything we can with wind and solar, and we can do a lot with wind and solar, and we will have storage, and we will have demand side consumption, and we will have grid, and there's different regions helping each other out. We will have lots of options that always come in first, but there are a few weeks every year, you know, maybe 2 years, 2 weeks in 1 year and 4 weeks in a different year that are very, very difficult to cover with the system. And we will simply have gas-fired power plants that run with hydrogen, CO2 free. Yes, or maybe they run with ammonia. I rather guess with ammonia, but that's a different question. It's hydrogen in a way, yeah? And we've always been very clear that this is why we can promise 100% security of supply, or 99 point, like today, the same security of supply we today have in the electricity system. And this had not been a change of horses or anything. And that's why I think it's so important to distinguish, to make a difference between fossil gas, which we have to move out of as quickly as possible, and these power plants, which we need for 100% renewables. You know, they're not just an evil we accept for a transitional period. They are something we absolutely rely upon to move to 100% renewables. And yes, of course, there's a danger that they will be running too long on fossil gas once they are there, yes? But we have this in different things. I mean, if we build power lines, you can have coal electricity in these power lines, or you can have renewable electricity in the power lines. If we don't build the power lines, we will never be able to move to 100% renewables. And that's why I'd really ask you to try and understand, we have not been switching horses. We are trying to get to 100% renewables and to do everything that we need for it.
Thanks, Ingrid. Michael.
Well, I mean, I couldn't agree more. I think if we look at the energy system, in the end, what is needed to get to a full green energy system is a acceleration of the build out of renewables. It is an acceleration of the build out of grids, and it is, like Ingrid said, at least in some countries like Germany, we need backup capacity. And I mean, the way the taxonomy is set up is exactly so. You build a gas asset, but with a clear path to eventually transform that into hydrogen, or be it ammonia. Let's see what the technology then is. And to come back to Laurie's point, Laurie, you're fully right. I mean, we clearly communicate that we will only invest into gas assets if two conditions are met. One is there needs to be some kind of remuneration for those assets, because you don't build an asset now with a 20-year lifetime that in the end, like Ingrid rightly said, will only operate for 1,000 hours a year. Yeah, so that doesn't run in the wholesale market. So there needs to be an additional income stream. So that's something we need to discuss. And secondly, we also need to be very clear that there is a clear perspective to have green gas available by the mid of the 30s. And therefore, I think what's important, at least talking about Germany, that we now start to talk about green infrastructure. So how do we make sure that maybe existing gas networks or new or converted gas networks are then available for hydrogen, that we make sure that we also get now electrolyzers up and running, so that we get that hydrogen economy running. I mean, we're talking about 15 years, that sounds a lot, but I mean, give you an example. The biggest electrolyzer that is currently operational has 10 megawatts. Yeah, and I mean, we're talking about, I think, a target of 10 gigawatts by 2030. So that's a huge step to get there. And that refers back, Hans, to your question. That's why I asked for pragmatism. I think we now need to get it all running, get it going, because otherwise we won't meet it.
Yeah, I think it does.
May I add one more detail? It always sounds so expensive to say we have all this backup there that just stands around and you don't need it in just 2 or 4 or 6 weeks a year or whatever it may be, you will need it. We calculated that if you build cheap gas-fired power plants, which are not the most efficient, but they're okay efficient, and as they hardly ever run, it doesn't matter that they're not the most efficient. If we have a backup capacity of 60 gigawatt in Germany, which is about double what we have today in gas, this would cost us 4% of the costs we spend on electricity, 4% to have this backup capacity there. And of course, it's extremely expensive to run it because the green hydrogen is very expensive. But as we hardly ever want to run it, we think that's okay and that's fair. And that's a good price for security of supply.
Yeah, sorry. I mean, the power system. Oh, go ahead, Michael.
No, I mean, just if you take the UK, I mean, they already have a capacity mechanism for gas in place. I think that cost the UK about 1 billion per annum. And I mean, if you compare that to the total cost of the electricity system, so Ingrid is fully right. We are here talking about just a few hours in a kind of an infrastructure. So compared to the overall system, that's it is relevant, but it's not material.
Fair enough.
I'm happy about your support, but not sure that everybody will make it better because we are now running on stream with RWE.
Yeah, the power system is built for a few hundred hours. I mean, it's always been built for a few hundred hours. That's not new in 2022. You know, it's built for the peak. And so the question you rightly say, look, I'm not against dispatchable capacity at all. And I also think that gas has a place. The question is how much is really needed, and how much will the signaling, and as Michael says, you know, it won't get built without firm signaling and firm commitments, but will we be looking back 15 years from now, you know, 2035, and facing down a bunch of stranded assets when we could have made greater progress on other ways to dispatch, whether that's energy efficiency, whether that is battery storage. You know, there's many other ways. This is my point, Ingrid. It's not that we are where we are. I mean, ironically, here we are in Germany, where you close down all the nukes and it's winter and there's a war in Ukraine, and yes, you know, it's cold and we need gas. You know, unfortunately, that is the situation we're in. By the way, just to Michael's point earlier, you know, here is a company that is a real success story, and not an early one, by the way. I mean, RWE became a success story at a moment when I think, you know, most people would have thought it was way too late in the game. It's not too late. And Michael, as you say, you know, companies that haven't made those decisions, or that have made them even later than RWE has, will they be selling dirtier assets into private hands? Well, yeah, but they'll be selling them for nothing. I mean, it will have cost them dearly.
All this discussion about should gas be in it, will there be stranded assets? I think it leads to a question of whether this black and white distinction in the taxonomy is actually all that helpful, and whether we would not have been better advised of having 3 statuses, right? I mean, there's clean, there's not clean, and there's not clean but helping us to get cleaner, or something like that. And gas could be in that category. Potentially nuclear could be in that category. And we wouldn't be having this discussion. And actually, similar things along these lines have been proposed in the process all along, of course, but it somehow didn't make it into the final draft. Is that something we should have done?
But at least I think it's a very interesting question, and that there are really these 2 approaches to taxonomy. One is saying we want a green label, that it's really green. You know, people can rely on it being really, really green, and it doesn't matter that it only covers part of the economy and that other parts have to be there and we need them, but they're not really green, but we want people to feel really comfortable with it. You know, that's a little bit like organic food, which has a very reliable label. And this is one okay approach to the taxonomy. And the other approach is to say, wow, we want this to be mainstream. You know, we want most of the money to go taxonomy with the taxonomy. And then, of course, you cannot be so super green, but then you can hope to really move the markets. And I'd be very interested in your opinion, Laurie, because you know more about this, which is from an environmental perspective, the more efficient way.
Well, I guess just, you know, to Hans's question, if this were any other sector, but the power sector, I would say it doesn't need to be black and white. Unfortunately, in utilities and power, electric power, it does need to be spelled out. That is, you know, we just can't mess around on this.
Because of what? Because it's so essential, and because it's the core of everything else, or why?
Yes, because it's so essential. I mean, by definition, people expect to turn on the light switch and, you know, have light. It's not an industry where we can blame supply chain failures, as Michael knows, you know, as the entire world, you know, of the corporate world is blaming supply chain failures. And it's not that we can't just say, well, we don't have strawberries on our grocery shelves, you know, for something. I mean, it has to work. And so I think given the sums of money that are involved, the sheer, you know, time horizons that are involved in investing in the kind of infrastructure that we're talking about, it has to be very clear.
I completely agree. I think we're talking about security of supply for electricity. Just think about our industries in Europe. Aluminum, it's about 30% of our cost of production. Right now, I was looking at the decarbonization of steel. The site from ArcelorMittal in the north of France, it's going to take 1 gigawatt of capacity, one nuclear reactor to decarbonize the site. So it's a really an issue of very important, not only for the general public, but also for our industries. They need security of supply for electricity, or they will not invest in decarbonization, or they will delocalize. And second, we cannot fail on our climate objectives, right? So we cannot bet. We have to take a more robust pathway to make sure that we reach our goals. It's very important. One thing I'd like to add, since I have I can talk, is to maybe add to the discussion an international perspective. We're not going to be the only taxonomy. There will be other taxonomies. I was talking about Canada. It's pretty sure nuclear is at the heart of the American low carbon strategy, so it's pretty sure the American one will include nuclear. And we're seeing some banks arriving in Europe. I mean, not banks, but I think we're seeing some American capital arriving in Europe. For instance, right now, you know, there is an opportunity for new nuclear reactors in Poland, and the Americans have promised a lot of money, right? So it's also an issue for us to be able to compete even in our own continent with banks coming from outside. So far, we've been, as a European nuclear industry, competing with the Russians, who bring a lot of funding to nuclear projects. I'm thinking about Hungary, and also with the Americans now arriving, right? And so I think it's very important that we take an international view. At some point in time, we'll have to harmonize our taxonomies at the worldwide level. I'm talking to Laurie, she's a specialist on that. But I think it's going also to create disruptions in competition for industries if we don't align our taxonomies from one continent to another.
On this international point, Michael, of course, you're active globally now in the US. You just announced a very exciting new partnership with Tata in India and so forth. How are you seeing the global landscape for taxonomies shaping up? And is it all broadly in line, or is it adding a lot of complexity because everyone is defining it slightly differently?
I think if you look at the current situation, you see that there are tons of rating agencies out there, so different ratings taking different perspectives. So from our point of view, it indeed would be helpful if there's some alignment going forward. So to give you an example, I mean, we very much support that the international standards setter is now also setting up the sustainable reporting directive, so that we are going for, like we have on financial accounting, that we also have a global standard on sustainability reporting, and that also then provides one single framework that is accepted. So therefore, I think for the EU being a big player, if we have one standard, is clearly helpful. But obviously, any European standard for me is clearly only an intermediate step. So in the medium term, we need to have international standards to make it comparable. But again, that's the pragmatism I'm talking about. I mean, we need to start somewhere. So therefore, I'm fine with what we have, but there must be a clear ambition to move towards kind of an international standard. And if you look what is currently happening around, as I said, the corporate social responsibility reporting topics, it is moving in that direction.
And maybe to link this to the first question, or actually the second question from the audience, from Johanna Schiede from the European Commission, have we missed out our chance to become the gold standard, or could we still become that?
Well, I mean, for me, the question is, do we need? So I think that goes back to your initial question. Do we need a gold standard? Yeah. So, I mean, what is the goal? The goal must be that we support that energy transition. And I mean, having said that, I think we need to look at the bulk of the industry and get that transformed. And Laurie obviously is right. In the energy industry, it's pretty, it's simple. It's black and white. So if it's renewable or not, and then yes, you have the discussion around nuclear and gas, but that's pretty much it. It becomes much more diverse if you go in the industry, and much more complex. So therefore, pushing it too hard in the end doesn't help the transition.
I agree. I also think that, you know, gold standard, does it have to be harmonized? I mean, over time, it will just become much more economic, and renewables will. It will just become much more economic. Batteries will be cheaper. Every other form of demand response, power, everything will become cheaper. So, you know, ultimately, does it really matter? No. And in the US, I mean, good luck waiting for them to come up with a standard. Ultimately, economics will drive it, and I think we'll get to the right outcome. It's just, you know, how much do we go beyond 1.5 degrees? In the meantime, while we're waiting around.
Ingrid?
I think my answer would be yes, we missed out the chance, and I would have liked to have a gold standard pulling internationally into the right direction. Yes. I don't know if you want to answer to the first question as well.
You mean the one on hydrogen, or? Because yeah, I kind of naturally come to the Q&A session, which is good. So
all right.
Or sorry, or is that the first question in the chat you mean, or the question I asked before that?
I was reading in the chat.
Oh, exactly, in the chat. Yeah, so that's good. So yeah, let's move over to the Q&A at the chat, and there's 3 already, but if there's more, please please just type them in or raise your hand. There's a raise hand button on Zoom, and you can actually, if you do that, I can call you up. You can unmute yourselves. You can turn on your camera if you want, and you can ask it in person, which is a bit more personal. But yeah, so first question from Armando Gucci is, are we doing enough to increase hydrogen or scale up hydrogen demand quickly enough? And I think that's what you wanted to take in, right?
Ways I could try a quick answer. Actually, I do think that we have to, as hydrogen will be scarce in the beginning, and we have sectors like the industry that absolutely need hydrogen. It makes sense to scale up demand through these sectors that we think absolutely do need hydrogen, to make sure that they really get the hydrogen they need. And we have to have the structures that they can pay for it. Yes.
Would anyone else want to answer on the hydrogen question, or otherwise I have a follow-up on hydrogen actually? But
no, I mean, maybe one point, since we are now, I mean, I guess people from the European Commission are also attending. So I would make a strong pitch for the current delegated act on RED 2, where they're defining criteria what is green hydrogen. And I mean, the proposal we're currently having is so restrictive. So my big fear is maybe that's a good framework, but let's say in 10 years time, but clearly not now. Because what we're currently doing is we're just putting additional requirements on hydrogen, and that just will hinder hydrogen to kick off. And as I said before, there's not much time left, so we need to get it running. And I think getting it running needs some pragmatism. And then over time, when we have the infrastructure, then obviously we can also move to what was called kind of the gold standard. But don't start with the gold standard. You stop it right in the beginning.
Yeah, I mean, we could have a whole separate topic on the on the hydrogen RED 2 standards. But yeah, I mean, for my part, at least I fully agree. I think pragmatism is needed there as well. Laura, Valerie, anything on hydrogen? Otherwise, I would move on actually to.
I would just like to make a comment. It's not going to surprise you. I think the European Commission strategy is only focused on renewable hydrogen. We know there will not be enough renewable resources in Europe to produce the hydrogen we need. So we need to relax these criteria and talk about low carbon hydrogen in general, to be able to think about being less dependent from and not replacing our dependence on oil and gas by a new dependency on renewable hydrogen coming from, faraway countries. I would also say that I've seen some countries, I will not give names, that think they're going to get their renewable hydrogen from Namibia. I think we have to be really careful. I think countries in Africa, you don't have, everybody doesn't have access to electricity. You have several million people in Africa who don't have access to electricity today, not even, of course, we are really far from having access to clean electricity. So I think we have to, on an ethical point of view, make sure that we don't ask these countries to provide us with low carbon hydrogen before they can provide their own people with the basic electricity supply.
Yeah, I mean,
may I put two sentences just on this? I absolutely agree that this delegated act is very important, that it's very important that it comes soon. We're really waiting on it, and projects are close to collapsing because we're not having it. But I heartily disagree on making it some pragmatic thing which leads us into the wrong direction. We have seen with the bioenergy issue that things can go really wrong if something that is supposed to be sustainable is the opposite. And we should not make this mistake again. And that's why we need a definition from the beginning, which sets us on the right path. Thank you.
Thank you again. Yeah, so there's two more questions. One on actually the questions of conversions. Should we not also be supporting presumably what this could mean is switching from coal to biomass, or from natural gas to biogas or biomethane? Yeah, any views on that? If that is an oversight, Ingrid, I can see a smile. You probably have one.
Thank you. Well, I don't think this is a short-term necessary thing to do in a taxonomy. I mean, we don't have enough biomass to switch from coal to biomass large scale, and we do not have enough green hydrogen yet to switch large scale. So this is nothing that needs to be done within this decade, I should say. That's why it's okay. It's not in there.
And same probably for biomethane and other conversions.
Yeah, I think none of these are large scale available this decade.
Right. Michael, any views on this? Would you? I mean, you still own a bunch of coal assets, right? Which could be, or even existing pre-taxonomy gas assets, which could be open for such conversions.
Yeah, I mean, that goes back to my pragmatism. I think the way the taxonomy is now set up at least hinders some conversions that could be otherwise realized. But I mean, as Ingrid said, I think now there is an agreement. It's probably now difficult to reopen it. But my personal view would be, I would have been a little bit wider on this one to get the transition running. But it is what it is. Yeah. But maybe coming back to Ingrid's point on the green hydrogen, I think that's for me very important, because the criteria that are currently in there. So green hydrogen is only if you build a new asset, if it's co-located with the electrolyzer, and it also needs to run at the same time. I mean, in Europe, we have the EU ETS, so we have the emission trading system. So any power that is used for an electrolyzer doesn't cause any additional CO2. Yeah, and I mean, if we look at our wind farms, I mean, we have wind farms coming off subsidies. They are there to operate. Why can't we use that green power to produce hydrogen? So we now kind of need to look for new assets that need to be new built, and then the electrolyzer even needs to be located close to that. And then even from the economics, you only can build run it then for a few hours when the wind asset is running. That's not, I mean, that will slow down the development.
That was a question to me, right? Hans, may I answer? Or I don't know. You said we might explode your session with red.
I think it's too broad a topic with too many connections, right? So I think having planning to have a discussion on the taxonomy only was always naive. So it's good to broaden up a bit.
Okay, I'll be brief. I'd be fine if we have a definition for green hydrogen that actually allows you to follow market signals. Yeah, actually, I think this would be a lot better and a lot more sensible, and we should optimize the entire system and not subsystems. But I also think it's very important that this comes now. I mean, we can't wait forever.
Yeah,
that makes sense. There's one more question in the chat on the OPEX CAPEX distinction in the regulatory framework, which is aimed at you, Michael. Is that something you can elaborate a bit more on? Yeah, how it could be changed to be made more effective?
Well, I mean, we have to be honest. I mean, the taxonomy is the taxonomy, so that that doesn't change now. I mean, two aspects I would bring forward. One is there are now discussions ongoing in Brussels, thinking about introducing additional negative criteria into the taxonomy. That is something I would clearly ask not to happen. And the second one is more towards investors. I think when we talk, for example, about the Corporate Sustainable Reporting Directive, here I think we need to set the right focus on really investments. So it's the way how we apply the taxonomy. And so to give you an example, when we talk to investors, we experience that whenever you engage with the investors in our equity story, they fully buy into that one and also invest into us. It only becomes difficult if you have very simple investors that just use metrics out of the machine. Yeah, so there is some kind of educational process that needs to take time. But I mean, I think that will come over time. That's why I kind of communicate that to also educate investors and then move them in this direction. But Lori, maybe you comment on this one.
Well, you're describing the entire investor corporate complex. Not just unique to utilities or the taxonomy. So there's some that really understand you and many that don't.
I guess that's why we need great CFOs to do the explaining. So wonderful. So we have 1 minute left. So I think, I'm afraid we don't have time for big closing statements. But if any one of you wants to leave us with a parting thought, then you'd be very welcome to do that. I see Ingrid unmuting herself. One sentence.
Just thank you for organizing this very interesting debate, and I was very pleased to discuss with you.
Okay, well, thank you all for joining that, and it's been a real pleasure. It's been very lively. There was a sufficient amount of disagreement, which I always like on a panel. And yeah, thank you for being so open.
You asked for it, didn't you?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, it's. I mean, that's the worst, right? I mean, having a discussion where everyone goes like, okay, yes, right. So thank you very much for being so open and for joining us today. And have a very good evening, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye. Good evening.